Welcome to Taste Buds. I'm Debra Eckerling, goal strategist, writer, and foodie, and today I'm speaking with children's book author, fiction writer, and poet Lesléa Newman, and her titles include The Babka Sisters, A Sweet Passover, and Hanukkah. And Hanukkah just came out. Yes, it is fall. I'm excited to talk to you about all things food and poetry and children's books, so welcome.
I'm so happy to be here.
This sounds like the best niche in the world, writing food books for kids.
Well, it was actually a surprise to me because one of my first children's books was called Matzo Ball Moon, and it's a Passover story. And all of a sudden, food started appearing in my children's books, mostly Jewish food, mostly Jewish comfort food, and it just kind of went on from there. I have to admit, I am not the world's best cook, though I do love to eat, but I have some specialties, and what I do really well, and it's mostly Jewish food that I learned from my grandmother. So my grandmother also appears in a lot of my children's books.
Oh, I love that. So can you give an example of your grandmother showing up in one of these beautiful stories?
Well, absolutely. So, in fact, the book I just mentioned, Matzo Ball Moon, is about a little girl whose grandma comes to visit and spend Passover with the family. And she and her grandmother make matzo ball soup together. And then what happens is everybody loves the grandmother's matzo ball so much that before the Seder begins, they all go into the kitchen and sneak a matzo ball. So when it's time to serve the soup, there's not enough matzo balls to go around. So, of course, the grandmother says, I don't need one. Everyone else should have one. And everyone feels bad. But then when they open the door for Elijah, the little girl says, I found one more matzo ball. And she points to the full moon and says, there's the matzo ball moon, Bubby, for you.
Aw, that's so sweet. I love it. So how much of these stories are true to life?
Well, they're fiction, but they definitely are based on my experience. So, for example, A Sweet Passover, another Passover book, because Passover is my favorite holiday, is about a little girl who is absolutely sick of matzah, doesn't want matzah anymore. And her grandfather, who's based on my father, makes a matzah brie. And then, through making the matzah bride, tells the story of Passover. And at the end of the book, of course, the little girl changes her mind, and she and her grandfather make a matzah bride together.
Ah, you must have had like this major food influence growing up.
Well, my grandmother was from the old country. So, and she was a real balabooster, which is someone who like really runs the kitchen well. And she was a fantastic cook. So she used to say, and she could make a meal out of a potato and half an onion, because she grew up very, very poor. My mother, I have to say, was not the world's greatest cook, but she really was one of the world's greatest defrosters. And then, and then I am somewhere in between.
Wonderful. So what do you cook? What are your specialties?
So I am world famous for my chicken soup with the matzo balls and my applesauce. I also make a wonderful coleslaw, which my friend Van, who is no longer with us, unfortunately, taught me how to make. But, when I eat that coleslaw, I think of him, of course. Latkes. Babka is very challenging. And even though I did write a book called The Babka Sisters, and there is a recipe, it's actually a friend of mine created the recipe. And many, many people tested it. And I got to be the beneficiary of that because I never made it, but I did get to taste it.
The spirit of the Babka Sisters is all about sharing food, which I think is correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I am. Sharing food is very Jewish.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes. Part of our every holiday, every Shabbat, it's really important to break bread together. Literally break bread, break challah, break matzah, depending on the holiday.
The subtitle of the show is Food, Cooking, and Community because they all go hand in hand. It is also so Jewish. So why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a way to show love. It's a way to nourish each other, literally and figuratively. And, when you sit down and share a meal together, it does invoke immediately a sense of community. And especially, when everyone brings something to share and you learn about them and it's a conversation starter, and you either love their food or you don't love their food, but you have to pretend you love their food. A lot of things happen around the table.
This is true. So tell me about your new book, Hanukkah, which is out in the fall. What is the story behind it?
Right. Well, at least it didn't come out in the spring. That would have been even funnier, right? So the story, the main character is named Lior, and he kind of takes the reader by the hand and shepherds them through the holiday. So explains the holiday, explains his family's tradition. Different guests come to his family. I almost said Seder. See, I have Passover on my mind. Come to the table, and they all bring food. They spin the dreidel. They just have a wonderful time together. It's very Hamish. And then at the back, there are some crafts and a couple of recipes.
Oh, so it's a kid's book, but it's also an activity book. I think all cookbooks are activity books for grown-ups.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, then there's my book, Here is the World, which is about, not all of the Jewish holidays, but many of them. I think about a dozen. And in the back of that book, there is a recipe or an activity for every single holiday.
Ooh, you have all the bases covered. Did you ever feel like this was going to be your life?
Well, I always knew I was going to be a writer. I started out writing poetry, which I still write, but the children's book came later. So now I'm kind of equally divided between writing for adults and writing for children. But my first love is poetry. That really is. And I have a lot of poems about food.
What inspires them? What started the poetry for you?
So I grew up in Brooklyn, and then when I was 8, we moved to Long Island, which I really was very unhappy about. One reason was because my grandmother, who lived across the street from us from Brooklyn, now lived a 45-minute car ride away. So, nobody said to me, "Why don't you write some poetry? It might make you feel better." But somehow, innately, that's what I did. And then I never stopped. So I've been writing poetry for many decades, and then just like in the children's books, food started showing up in my poems. I have a poem called "How to Make Matzo Ball," in fact, and after I wrote that poem, um, I wrote the book "A Sweet Passover." So one really led to the other. And I have poems about my grandmother, and food appears in those poems. So it's just kind of, you deal with food every day. It's in our lives. So of course it's going to show up in my writing.
Do you have advice for people? And I'm especially fascinated about the poetry.
Well, I think the most important thing is to read poetry. So if you don't know where to start, you can pick up an anthology that has poetry written by many people. And when you find some poets in there that you like, go buy their books. And I find whenever I'm not sure what to write next, reading poetry really can be very inspiring. And then to develop a habit of writing, every day, once a week, twice a week, whatever is comfortable for you, and just give it a try and see what happens. And you will be amazed, surprised, and delighted by the genius that lives inside of you.
Love that. And so the other part of me, I'm a goal strategist, author, so I'm all about getting the words out of your head and onto the page. What is your earliest food memory?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, it's not a good one.
It
I
doesn't matter.
so I was a very, very fussy eater as a child, and this was of great frustration to my mother. And I remember that when I was young, she served me oatmeal, which I hated. And we were going to the circus, which was a really big deal. And she said that I could not go to the circus unless I ate my oatmeal. And as I had an older brother who teased me. I remember about that and with the oatmeal. And then I can't remember if I ate the oatmeal or not. I know we did go to the circus, but I'm not really sure if I ate the oatmeal. I kind of doubt it because to this day I really hate oatmeal.
So there was like an oatmeal bride that you somehow got around to get to the circus. But it's vivid, right? Food memories, whether they're happy or not so much, they're some of the strongest out there.
That's true. That's true.
I want to go back to the books for a minute. What benefit do you think your books being out in the world serve?
So for children, there is this concept called mirrors and windows. So when a child reads a book, if the family in the book is like their own, it's like looking in a mirror. If the family is not like their own, it's like looking through a window and seeing another culture. And then there's also, so it's windows, mirrors, and sliding doors. So you slide open the door and you enter the world of the story. So what I hope is that, particularly in these books that we've been talking about, is that Jewish children will see themselves in these books and feel proud and feel excited and feel like they have a place to belong. When I was growing up, there were definitely no Jewish children's books. I never saw a family like mine in a book. And so it's really important for kids to see themselves in books. And it's really important for kids to see them families and kids who are not like themselves, so they learn about the world. And variety is the spice of life. All right, we'll use a food metaphor. And they will see that there's all kinds of people in the world, and that's a wonderful thing.
Now, I know you wanted to share a food poem, so
Yes.
I feel like now would be the right time. So go for it.
So this is awesome. So when I was growing up in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, New York, there was a knish shop called Mrs. Stahl's Knishes, and I wrote a poem about them because, well, you'll see why. Ode to a knish shop. Mrs. Stahl's sold kasha knishes, oi gewalt, were they delicious. To eat one was to have a feast, for each one weighed a pound at least. When I was young, they cost a nickel, cheaper than a kosher pickle. In Brighton Beach, beneath the L, seduced by that arresting smell, I'd take the last place in the queue on Coney Island Avenue, then perch upon a worn red stool and try my hardest not to drool, as I watched Mrs. Stahl herself pluck knishes from a metal shelf and serve them piping hot with pride. The sign outside bragged, baked, not fried. The pastry, bigger than my fist, caressed my tongue like being kissed. So savory, so plump, so sweet, that knish knocked me right off my feet. The outside dough was parchment thin, yet strong enough to hold within buckwheat growths that smelled of earth and added inches to my girth. But in those days, I didn't care a whit about my derriere. That akasha knish was heaven sent, no nickel ever better spent.
I love that. You're just so there.
So there.
I could almost taste the knish. Food is the senses and poems are the senses. So what do you need to do to bring all that out and make me hungry for knishes?
Well, I think one thing that's really important is to use sensory detail. So, in this poem, obviously, you have taste, you have smell. I'm not sure that you have any sounds, but you have sights and you have texture. So, the more specific you can be using that kind of sensory detail, the more you, as the writer, are immersed in the setting of the poem. And so your reader will become immersed as well.
And it feels like you also use that skill set for your kids' books.
Oh, absolutely. So one little writing tip I'll pass along to your listeners about writing children's books is the same thing. Sensory details are important, but it's also important to remember that the illustrations take care of the sensory detail of sights, right? So it's very hard to illustrate a taste, a smell, a sound. So, we rely on the sense of sight so much, but don't forget those other senses, especially when you're writing children's books.
Is there something you know now that you wish you knew at the start of your writing career?
Um, let's see. I wish I knew that I would meet so many wonderful people, and my writing would help me enter a fabulous community of children's book writers who have really become family and home to me, and that I would be successful, but it would take a really, really long time. And it takes a lot of patience. All of my books and poems probably go through between 15 and 30 drafts. And to just develop that sense of patience. And also that, to me, that work, that revision is a very joyful thing.
Do you snack for inspiration when you're writing?
Oh my God, that is such a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that. So, my beloved grandmother always said to eat a little piece of chocolate every day. Life shouldn't be bitter. So I have carried on that tradition, but I have found that as I grow older, it's not one little piece of chocolate. It's definitely more than one. So, yeah, I reward myself with chocolate. I take a break with a little bittersweet chocolate. I definitely indulge. Yeah.
Well, there is nothing wrong. Well, first of all, chocolate is healthy, but there's also nothing wrong for bringing sweetness in your life in the form of something that is decadent and delicious.
I think after we finish talking, I'm going to go have some chocolate, as a matter of fact. Now I feel like
You
having some chocolate.
you are welcome. Is there any final food for thought that you want to leave the audience with?
Oh, let's see. Food for thought. I would say Essen in gesund, which means eat in good health.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much, Lesléa Newman. Where can people learn more about you and your books?
So my website is very simple. It's my name, lesleanewman.com. You can find my poetry, my children's books, a way to contact me, more information about me than you would ever need to know, including some pictures. And I'm sure there is at least one picture of my grandmother and myself on my website.
Nice. And we will have all of that information if you go to jewishjournal.com/podcast. You'll read the articles, and we're going to do a surprise recipe to go with the conversation. Thank you so much, Lesléa Newman. Thank you for tuning in to Taste Buds with Deb. Don't miss an episode. You can subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, and or your favorite podcast platform. And you can learn more at tastebudswithdeb.com. Until next time, bon appetit.